Greetings, fellow humans, and welcome to the Renaissance Yorkshireman podcast. Today, I'd like to discuss a little bit about some aspects of game theory, specifically zero-sum games and non-zero-sum games, or expansive games, as I'm going to call them, and how your psychological perspective, particularly with reference to these aspects of game theory, can really colour your view of how the world works, and how if you start off with the wrong perspective, you will reach wrong conclusions, despite the fact that your logical reasoning skills actually might be quite solid. So in the first instance, zero-sum games and non-zero-sum games, what are they? So a zero-sum game is essentially where if someone loses, someone else wins. So, for example, I could bet my friend on the outcome of a sports game. So, for example, I like on occasion to watch snooker and I love watching Ronnie O'Sullivan. So perhaps Ronnie O'Sullivan is playing, I don't know, Jude Trump or something, some player or other. I bet my friend £100 that Ronnie O'Sullivan will win. So if Ronnie O'Sullivan wins, my friend loses £100 and I gain £100. So 100 minus 100 is 0. It's a zero-sum game. If Ronnie O'Sullivan loses, I give my friend £100, I'm losing £100, he gains £100. 100 minus 100 is 0. This is a classic example of a zero-sum game. And many of the sports games that are played are zero-sum games. One team wins, the other team loses. One team gains at the expense of the other team. Now, of course, it's not always quite that straightforward. So, for example, in the Premier League in the UK, it could be a win or a loss, or it could be a draw. One team wins, they get 3 points, and the team that loses gets 0. Both teams draw, they get 1 point apiece. So this is more or less a zero-sum game, but it's got a slight spin on the rules. But in its essence, it's a zero-sum game. Now, I don't really need to go into very much more detail than that, because as humans, we intrinsically understand this. You play your friend at chess. You play your friend at backgammon. One person wins, one person loses. Sometimes there is the option of a stalemate where it's a draw. But we all understand this. Now, I'll talk about non-zero-sum games or expansive games in a minute. But first I want to give you a couple of examples from human behaviour from outside the sports arena. So if we take the example of a group of white nationalists who, let's face it, in America, there's been a lot of news stories about white nationalists. Some people say Donald Trump has empowered them. There are armed groups who are white nationalists. Now, these white nationalists, how are they looking at the world? Well, they're using a zero-sum game as the prism that they're looking at the rest of the world. So they're thinking, my tribe, white people, we gain when these other non-whites, black people, Mexicans, whatever other non-white people you want to mention, they have to lose for my tribe to gain, right? This is a classic zero-sum game attitude. Now, with the perspective that they've chosen to take, their logic is entirely correct. So, in essence, it's not a problem of logical reasoning, it's a problem of the perspective that they've taken in the first instance. Now, ironically enough, or perhaps in the crazy world of 2021, it's not ironic, I don't know, I've kind of lost track of what's ironic and what isn't. But social justice warriors also start off with this zero-sum game perspective. But who they perceive as their tribe is quite different from white nationalists. So a lot of social justice warrior types are starting off with this perspective of it's the patriarchy, it's white men who are the problem. For my gang, my group, my tribe to gain, we need to take from white men and the patriarchy. Now, given that their perspective that they started with the zero-sum game, this is entirely a logical deduction to make. However, I would argue again that the social justice warriors are starting with the wrong perspective. So, white nationalists and social justice warriors, while they may on the surface appear to disagree on quite a lot, they're agreeing on the rules of the game. They're agreeing that it is a zero-sum game that humans are playing with each other. This is absolutely the wrong perspective a lot of the time. Now, there can be situations where it is the correct perspective, but I would argue where we are in human history now, with the state of capitalism as it is, and the necessity for post-capitalist systems and the transition to game B type scenarios, and I believe post-capitalism and game B to basically be synonymous, we need non-zero-sum games or expansive games. Here's my take on expansive games with a post-capitalist spin on it. I would argue that there are at the absolute minimum at least 3 issues that we simply can't compromise on. One is the military-industrial complex. One is consumption habits, consumption patterns, and consumption systems. And the third is freeing your mind. According to the Stockholm Peace Research Institution, globally, we as a planet spend $1,000 billion a year on the arms trade. Well, this is a complete and utter piss take, really. I mean, let's face it. The arms trade represents a loss for humans, more than 99% of humans. Of course, there are a small number of psychopaths and people who are willing to turn off their consciences who make a lot of money from arms dealing, from bribes and kickbacks. But another clear point about the arms trade is it's not on the news agenda. Now, when you hear people like the BBC talking about fake news, they're talking about stories which have been made up or embellished, stories which might have kind of a kernel of truth at the bottom, but have had, so much added to them, which is just nonsense. However, fake news is not just about made up stories. It's about the stories, the genuine stories of human interest that are not making it into the news. And I would argue that $1,000 billion a year on the arms trade should be on the news cycle every bloody day. And these journalists, the BBC and the Guardian, who I think are classic examples, are complicit in the arms trade because they are not talking about it and how it damages human society. So, for example, Libya was bombed back to the Stone Age under the administration of Barack Obama and headed up by Hillary Clinton leading the charge to destroy Libya. So this was a problem for ordinary Libyans because they've had their houses destroyed, they've had their infrastructure destroyed, they've had their jobs and their businesses destroyed. But it's not just a loss for those Libyans who had their countries bombed back to the Stone Age, it's also a loss for the American taxpayer. And as we all know, in this day and age, companies pay very little in tax. The burden of taxation falls on individual taxpayers. This issue of the arms trade, it has to be on the agenda of expansive games. We cannot continue as a human race to indulge in this level of arms trading. So it's primarily the Americans who are doing this, but they're not alone. My government, the UK government, the French government, the Germans, the Swedes, the Chinese and the Russians are all massive arms dealers. And in the game that is being played at the moment within the different political systems that we have, basically variations on capitalism, it's accepted that this is a reasonable part of the game. It's just not acceptable. This is not a zero-sum game. We have to bin the arms trade, and then it becomes an expansive game, because that money that was going into the arms trade and the people who were working, the scientists and the engineers, etc., who were working on creating more inventive ways to murder people, they can now go and work in, I don't know, creating more sustainable systems. Perhaps that money could go into healthcare systems or education systems, so that Americans could actually enjoy, I don't know, universal free healthcare like, pretty much every other developed country enjoys. And a lot of that money could go into the education system, so that we could have classes that had a maximum of say 15 or 16 students a class, but had a median and modal level of between 8 and 12. And then people would really learn in our education system. The second point, which is unconditional, is consumption habits. So you may or may not have heard of the resource-based economy, cradle-to-cradle systems, or the circular economy. If you haven't heard of these things, go and Google them. At the moment, under capitalism, we have a cradle-to-grave resource system. So for example, you buy a laptop. Your laptop will probably work fairly well for about 2 years, plus or minus 6 months. After a certain amount of time, it's going to stop working efficiently. You might get by with it for a while, but probably you're going to need to go out and buy a new laptop. That old laptop goes into landfill, you buy a new laptop. That old laptop is still full of precious metals and other resources. So in a cradle-to-cradle system, what might happen is you would take that to a computer shop, they would replace 2 or 3 parts, you would get it back, it would still work pretty much good as new. And this could go on more or less indefinitely, or it could be that you take that computer back to a shop and it's taken apart and all its parts are reused, but it doesn't go to landfill. And finally, what I would argue is unconditional in our transition to Game B systems and post-capitalism is free your mind. I'm just going to touch on journaling. Now, I do intend on making a video just about journaling, but I'll mention 2 things. So I started keeping a journal last year, and 2 of the things that I pretty much always do in my daily journal is I have a gratitude section and I have a section called the metascript method. Now, the gratitude section, I write what I'm grateful for. So it might be something as simple as having a roof over my head, or having fresh water come out of my tap, or having good quality food, or that my daughter is a well-adjusted human and not going around doing crazy things. Or it might be that I have a lot of good friends who give me support. It could be just about anything. But the important thing is you actually think about the things that are going right in your life and that you're grateful for. Because let's face it, there's plenty of shit out there and there's plenty of shit things that happen in the world. And it's very easy to get overtaken with this negativity and the shit out there. And the final thing I'd like to mention about the journal that I keep is I use the metascript method. Now, I got this off a YouTuber by the name of Mark Quepet, Queppet, who goes by the name of Universal Man on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube and put in Universal Man metascript method, you can print out his free PDF. I found this extremely useful for habit change. So in a nutshell, what you do is you pick one habit that you have that's negative and that you want to change, and then you keep the metascript journal. So essentially, and you really need to read the PDF to get all the details and do some work about it, but in its essence, what you do is you're trying to change a particular habit, and you'll have successes and you'll have failures. What you do is when you have a success or when you have a failure, you journal about it. So what happened? and you write about what happened when you failed, or what happened when something came up and you succeeded in not doing your habitual action. And then you think about what happened just before and what happened just after, and you write about it. After a few weeks, a few months, could be longer, you will start to notice patterns in your life that particular times you failed to do your thing. And then you can look at why you did it, and then you can change it. Or you'll look at the situations where you have successes and you'll notice patterns. And you'll think, oh, I'm going to put myself in that situation more often because I find it easier to change my negative habits. Anyway, these are methods that I've used. I started using them last year in 2020, and I think they've positively improved my mental health and have helped me change as a person. And in my analysis of post-capitalism, we need both systems change and personal change. So you have to do the work on yourself, but simultaneously, we need to change the systems that we have. And the final point I'd like to make is that Julian Assange is a political prisoner of the British state who is being held in Belmarsh prison, and this is completely unacceptable. Julian Assange must be freed. Thank you for giving me your time today. Peace.